Hello, my name is Chloe, she, her pronouns. I grew up in New Zealand, but I went to, so now my accent has a bit of a. I'm the author of These Violent Delights, Our Violent Ends, and recently Valley Fortune. A lot of historical merged with, slightly fantastical. I'm really fascinated in writing about 1920s to 1930s Shanghai. I was born there before my parents immigrated with me when I was two. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here chatting with you guys. Yeah, I mean, I really don't think that I could have written any of the books that I have right now without my exact like cultural heritage, being my background. Um, the reason why I got interested in 1920 Shanghai as a time period to begin with is because my parents talk about it a lot and they're very proud of being from Shanghai. The way that I always kind of make the comparison is that people from Shanghai are as obsessed with being from Shanghai as New Yorkers are very obsessed with being from New York. Like it becomes their personality trait. They're not Americans, they're New Yorkers. And in the exact same way, my parents are very like, we're from Shanghai. Um, so, growing up, they really just liked telling stories from things that they knew about, this little folktale specifically. It's just a Shanghai regional thing, or like these food dishes are like, oh, my grandma made that for me, my great aunt made that for me. And I guess I kind of grew up with this fascination for this like specific city and for the kind of golden age that they would kind of talk about. I had grown up reading a lot of Western books about the 1920s. I was really interested in like the Roaring Twenties in New York, the Roaring Twenties in like Chicago, but I could never find anything that kind of merged my two interests together in a way that I wanted it, right? I wanted to kind of hear my parents' stories again, but in the YA books I was really addicted to reading, but it wouldn't kind of appear that way. Like if it was an English novel, most times if it was about 1920 Shanghai, it was about like the British merchant who went in and like solved mysteries and saved the day. And I was like, I don't care about this. Um, I really, really wanted to see the kind of like time period that my parents talked about a lot and the city that I really, really loved in a way that I had heard about it. So without the kind of like love my parents had built in, it wouldn't have steered me to then go, oh, I actually really want to fill this niche that I think is missing at the moment.
And I guess like also tying in like with the integration of like your culture and your heritage is that I noticed a lot through your books that you include a lot of like pinyin throughout, which I think is like super cool and fun. So like how like why did you decide to do that and like how did you decide like when to do that, I guess?
Yeah, it's really tricky, I think, trying to balance portraying a different language when you're like mostly writing in English. Because when I sort of sat down and thought, okay, this is going to be set in 1920 Shanghai, it's this really delicate balance between not mulling over the fact that most times you're going to be speaking either in Mandarin Chinese or Shanghainese Chinese, but at the same time, like my primary language is English. Like to be writing as a member of the diaspora means that I need to balance how I'm perceiving the world and how I can tell stories to my limitations without, kind of imposing an imperialist like stance on it myself by only making them speak English, right? I think fortunately or like unfortunately because of colonialism, the characters in 1920 Shanghai realistically would also be speaking English a lot by nature of, the people that they're interacting with or their own upbringing, because a lot of my characters would have been raised speaking Western languages in order to blend in with the city. So it was kind of like I had to decide what scenarios would they only be speaking Shanghainese in and how do I portray that while still writing in English. And that was kind of, I'd put phrases here and there that I think a lot of diaspora readers would also easily be able to pick up, and it would feel like little Easter eggs. You'd be like, oh, I understand that. And it's really fun because it feels for once like the book is written for you. It's not that you have to catch up and pick up the context clues in the same way that I think a lot of like immigrant Asian kids are reading like American books and they're like, oh, I don't know what like this thing that every white person in Connecticut probably knows, but I'll pick it up with context clues, right? We grow up doing that. And it was really fun for me to kind of flip it on its head a little, and suddenly the cultural majority are the ones using context clues to pick it up, because the very like tiny target audience inside is different. Suddenly it's about like the ones who do understand like those two languages, and they're like, oh wow, it's for me. So yeah, a lot of times I would kind of put like the pinyin in there if I just wanted to be like, oh look, this, you probably know this phrase. But also to kind of just continuously remind across the book, like, yes, we're all writing in English because we're a diaspora and this is what we're reading. But you know, in the setting of this, we're kind of, we just need to keep going, like, oh yes, like they are merging languages, they're very multilingual, this is kind of the world that they exist in.
So yeah, my question is just about like these violent delights, our violent ends, Foul Lady Fortune. Did you? I think I read once that like you split. Originally, These Violent Delights was like one book, and then you split that. But did you always want to make like a spin-off series with like Rosalind and Orion in like the same universe?
I did. I always knew that I wanted to do a spin-off with Rosalind, but I didn't really know what the story was going to be about until I actually got to writing it. But I did know way back when I was still splitting These Violent Delights and Our Violent Ends into two. So, you know, in the beginning when I was really just editing book one, I knew that I wanted to do a spin-off with Rosalind, because I think the way that I could already foresee Our Violent Ends wrapping up was that Rosalind's story was the one who was left so unfinished. Everyone else kind of had a bit of a, you know, a character arc that went a certain way, that played out a certain way that I was satisfied with. But Rosalind is kind of just left in the carnage of her mistakes. And to me, it felt so unfinished. And I was sitting there looking at her, I was thinking like, this is so many, I think especially teenagers can relate to the position she gets left in, because she makes so many mistakes, no one likes her, she feels like she has to fix the entire world on her shoulders, she knows that no one likes her, then she hates herself, and it just feels like a very like coming of age narrative, because everyone hates themselves when you're young. Anyhow, so I really wanted to work with that because it felt like there was a story in that. No matter how bad the mistake you think you made was, there's always redemption. You can always help yourself get up again. They're always going to be there for you. No matter how bad a immoral thing you think you did, that doesn't make you a bad person. There were so many themes in that I really wanted to work with. And it didn't fit into the original duology, which is why it felt like I wanted her to take center stage, be the protagonist, and do a spin-off rather than, you know, book 3 of These Violent Delights or something, because it didn't seem as fitting.
I really love what you said about like doing morally bad things doesn't make you a morally bad person, because like, yeah, I love that so much. But yeah, like reading Rosalind, definitely could relate to her. Just watching her like watch everything fall apart, like that was, yeah. So yeah.
So there's something that you mentioned in a previous interview where you talked about, I don't know the exact wording you were saying, but it was like, I think hesitance in writing Asian characters or like Asian American characters within your writing. And that was something that I remember also like in the few months that like when I've written things that I've had hesitance to like, how do I portray like Asian characters? Like, am I doing this correctly? What is it? Right? And there was this weird discomfort. And I haven't necessarily processed through that, I guess, and like put a hand on what it is exactly. But I was curious, like, what was it like for you to kind of transform like from, I guess, like how you started originally when you were writing to eventually writing an entire novel that is based on Asian characters and is set in China and all that?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question, because I think it's such a complicated topic, right? It's one of those things where, of course, we really want to see ourselves, but then there's, I think what it's called, it's a term that's been floating around, like, you know, the literature sphere for a while, but there's the burden of representation, because there's so little out there already. If you do write a story like that, it suddenly feels as if you have to represent every single like person who shares your identity, and it's impossible. because no, like, if we're talking about like Asian people as a whole, there are so many Asian people in the world, right? It's completely impossible to represent every single experience. But so long as there aren't that many stories yet, it feels like we have to try, or else we're letting people down. And it kind of comes hand in hand with this idea of like, well, do I even have the right to be writing it? Will people even be reading it? And it's so complicated because on one hand you do want to put your own stories on the page, on the other hand you're kind of like, well, what if no one's gonna read it? And then what if what if no one in my own community wants to read it, right? So yeah, as I was, I think, growing as a writer, I would, in my first few manuscripts, I would just write white characters because that's what I grew up reading. It didn't occur to me that, you know, you could put your own identity on the page and reach other readers of your own identity and say, hey, look at how I went through this. Like, isn't that relatable? And then to have other people go, yeah, like that was the same for me. Foreign experience, until people started doing that and I started seeing, you know, books with Asian characters as we were approaching like the late 2010s and thinking, oh well, if they're paving the way, I can do something like that as well. I really do think the fact that I debuted in 2020 made a huge difference, that I felt comfortable writing something set in 1920 Shanghai. You know, if other authors like Joan He in 2019 or Melinda Lowe in like later 2010s, if they hadn't published first, I wouldn't have felt comfortable kind of following the precedents that they had set. And it was only because of them that I could actually sit there and think, oh well, actually I think I can do that. You know, they did it. Let me go do that too. Yeah, but it's a constant work in progress, I think, for writers of marginalized identities. You're just constantly grappling with, I want to tell the story how it comes to me, but I want to make sure that I'm not stepping on another person's toes and claiming that this, you know, is supposed to represent all of us. This is just one story. It can't represent the whole monolith, but hopefully this one story opens the path for everyone else to be telling their one stories as well.
You mentioned a few authors within this, but was there a moment for you that kind of you're like, oh, I really can do this? And were there some authors that really for you opened those doors that made you realize that I can write about my identity, and that gave you the, I don't know if it's maybe confidence or the realization that you could, that it's a really pivotal part in how you can write as well?
Yeah, I think the very first instance that I can think of that is, so this trilogy is not even one that she's well known for, but Jenny Han's Burn for Burn trilogy that she co-wrote with Siobhan Vivian. It came out, I think, maybe 2011-ish, but I was much younger then, because I remember it was in my high school library. And the cover is three girls who are the main characters. One of the main characters is East Asian, and they just had her front and center in the middle of the book. Again, if this was like 2011, I was not seeing that anywhere. So of course I picked up the book immediately because I was like, oh look, like she literally looks like me. And the character was so well written in the sense that she was allowed to be really mean, really bitchy, really rude, and so three-dimensional. And you could just tell that this was written by someone who wasn't like, oh, I'm writing an East Asian character, she has to be like this certain brand of like Asian, in the way that we were seeing it in the early 2010s. It was so clear that this was just written as a person. She was allowed to be mean, she was allowed to be rude. And I loved her so much. And I think that was the very first moment where I was like, wow, we're allowed to do this. Which, you know, had a big effect on how I would then start growing as a writer as well.
That's so awesome. And I think it's really powerful to always learn about like these moments, and to learn about how how all of us come to these realizations, and especially for you as like a person in the industry and having done such incredible work, like how you've come to like how your journey has brought you to this point. I think that's really cool. So, another aspect of your books, and something that's been talked about in a lot of previous interviews, is your, I guess, of Shakespeare, or a great like of Shakespeare. So, I guess the question would be is, I guess, what drew you to Shakespeare, and I guess applying it to the environment of 1920s, 1930s Shanghai, and also kind of like a bit of a controversial question is. Shakespeare, and I think this has been talked about before. It's like this. It's almost in every school, at least like in the most Western countries, teach Shakespeare, and oftentimes, like I think Shakespeare probably gets a little bit of a bad rap because everyone's like, "Oh, I had to read that in high school." It's like, "Oh, I get it," all that type of stuff. So, do you have anything to say to that, and maybe to some people that might not be like the biggest fan of Shakespeare either?
I mean, on a really meta level, I think that's exactly why I wanted to work with Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is completely like ubiquitous, like over Western education, right? Everyone knows Shakespeare, everyone knows Romeo and Juliet, and it felt kind of satisfying for me to take something that was such a touchstone of Western literature and just plop it into the East, and completely take a different lens on it and say, what happens when you look at this story from another angle? What happens if we re-examine like the power dynamics? But you know, just in general, I quite like Shakespeare. I think he's really good at some of these like craft and prose, you know, that he does. I think there's a reason why he survived like 400 years. Like, yes, he is an old white man. I think that's also why. But a lot of it is a reclaiming of sorts, to be like, let's take the story and tell it a different way. Like, I've caught you now. You know Shakespeare. I've caught your interest. Now let's do it completely different. Because I think I was very aware that to tell a story in 1920 Shanghai, like, first of all, it automatically almost alienates itself from the larger American audience, because, you know, different country, it's China to begin with, like that's its whole other can of worms. But then you add Romeo and Juliet to it, and suddenly people are like, oh, that's really familiar. And it kind of merges together these things in a way that I felt was really thematically fitting for this merge of worlds in 1920 Shanghai itself, this merge of worlds that a lot of Asian diaspora have to go through, where you're trying to like put together this like Western society you're constantly trying to like, you know, integrate yourself in, and then this homeland that you feel like you're alienated from. So yeah, it really, it's not so much Shakespeare itself that was the most interesting, but reworking Shakespeare into a different context. Again, like I was an English major throughout college, so the idea of retellings, reimaginings, and how that has such a relationship constantly with, you know, further works is so interesting to me, more so than just analyzing, oh, what does this line and paragraph mean? I do like that as well. Again, I do think a lot of his quotes slaps. But the most interesting thing is that when you examine Shakespeare in relation to a lot of things, he becomes so much more interesting. You know, people who don't like Shakespeare, I get it. It's really hard to read. If you open a SparkNotes, it really helps. Some of the ideas are more interesting than the way he puts them. So yeah.
That's really, really cool. And I really like how you talk about taking this, I guess, like this person that has dominated a lot of like Western education and really, really tied it into this thing that many, especially for the diaspora, like something we're all familiar with, but then maybe don't necessarily see ourselves in all the time, but then really use that in your books to put in a setting where we can and build characters that we can relate to, but then also have like this familiarity that's, I don't know if it's a stretch to say multicultural, but like maybe cross-cultural in a way. Yes, and I think that's really, really cool to really think about how you put that into your book.
Yeah. The research was kind of twofold in the sense that I depended for a starting point a lot on talking to my family, because to me that was the closest I could get to an authentic representation in the way that I was going for. You know, like I knew that when I set out that this was a novel first and foremost, it's not nonfiction. And if someone wanted to actually get a very, very, detailed narrative of what was going on, there are a lot of other resources that would be better for that purpose. I knew that I wanted to stay historically accurate for as much as I could, but I was also trying to tell a story first and foremost that was true to the spirit, more so than represent dates and facts and people. And by that I mean like historical people. So I would ask my parents, my relatives, what they know of that time. And I would kind of think, I would kind of almost brainstorm with them. Like, first of all, telling them, this is what the character wants. This is what's kind of going on at the time. Like, what do you think would be their interactions, their observations of the world, their observations of society? Especially my older relatives, because some of them, they weren't like around in the 30s or the 20s, but they were born in like the 50s. They kind of had the same like sensation of like, what was the political climate like? What did people think? That was a lot of the stuff I wanted to start out with, because that helps me build character decisions and character narratives and what they want, what they will ultimately end with. And then I would actually go the textbooks. Like, at that point, I would start looking up street names and what the actual political path of movement and, the invasion from Japan later in the 30s. Then I would start looking up facts to kind of put it all together, because at the end of the day, this is still, it tries to stay ingrained in the historical timeline. There's never a point where I'm kind of making things up or acting contrary to what was going on. Of course, in the original duology, like, I put a monster in, like, that was not happening in real life, obviously. But my intention was to always be emphasizing things that were happening, or further leaning into tensions or climates, right? So a lot of it would kind of be, okay, I'm going to look in this textbook to see what day the revolution unfolded. And then if I go back to my outline, it would be, okay, on this day, as the real revolution was unfolding, this is when the gangs dissolve and start fighting each other. This is when the monster comes out. Because at any point, it's always trying to supplement the true historical timeline by, adding in what I know of the people, what they were thinking. And of course, there's no one way to portray history, right? Different things. And I want that to come across in my novels. I never want it to feel like, oh, I'm trying to capture what 1920s Shanghai was like. The thing that I come back to is, if I think about how would someone write historical fiction about like 2022 United States? You couldn't write one topic. There are so many opposing factions and sides that one person's thoughts can't encapsulate what an entire country was thinking. And that's what I hope people will understand about reading historical fiction. That if you read these thoughts from, like, Juliet, that's just her perception of what was going on at the time. And I hope that it comes across that she's informed by setting, this world, and all of the historical facts will come through. But when I research, it's always to kind of build individual people, as opposed to there's one big, collective era of it.
So you already mentioned that you had to split the first duology, and of course, but after like These Violent Delights came out, I'm not sure when you started writing Foul Lady Fortune, but after you started seeing reactions from These Violent Delights, Our Violent Ends, was there any like pressure? What were you thinking while writing it, while sending it off to editors, Foul Lady Fortune specifically? Like, was there any sort of like hesitancy or like excitement, stuff like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Foul Lady Fortune was, I think, the hardest book I've ever written. And that's because I kind of got like, there's this term like second book syndrome. I got that with Foul Lady Fortune because These Violent Delights and Our Violent Ends had kind of existed originally as one book. So when I wrote Our Violent Ends, it felt so easy. Not because it was an easy book and not because I had most of it written. Like, actually, most of Our Violent Ends was completely new. When I split These Violent Delights, it kind of became 80% of the original manuscript went into These Violent Delights. A lot of it got reordered and reworked, and it got a new ending. 20% of the original manuscript became the climax of Our Violent Ends. Got a whole new different like lead up to that, all the events were completely new and fabricated, and it got a new ending. So, you know, a lot of Our Violent Ends was technically new, but it was so much easier because I already knew what that final climax is. I knew like everything I was working towards. I could just hit the ground running, basically. When I got to Foul Lady Fortune, I felt like I was pulling teeth for that entire first draft. I didn't know if I was writing something too similar to the original duology, and then I would suddenly flip and think, am I writing something too different to the original duology? And I'll lose all of my original readers because it's just not what they like. I was like flipping between like, is this too incomprehensible for people who haven't read the original duology? And then I went right to, is this too repetitive for people who have already read it? I think that just comes with the fact that a spin-off is quite hard to do because you're trying to pay your respects and homage to the world that existed before it, and yet you're still trying to make it exist on its own. And then, you know, outside of the craft stuff, it was the year I graduated college. So I was like moving like cities. I was trying to finish my thesis at the same time as drafting it, which, you know, that's just my own fault. I didn't time it very well, apparently. But it was, yeah, Foul Lady Fortune was really, really hard to write. I think it always is when something is trying to follow up on what is deemed commercially successful, because you always want to either replicate it or do even better. You never want to kind of deliver a flop after something people have perceived as doing well. At that point, I wasn't just writing for me anymore, because again, the whole story that existed within these Untitled and Our Violent Ends was kind of just, oh, like, I'll write it, see what happens, get it out into the world. By the time we got to Foul Lady Fortune, a lot of people were excited for it. It got announced before I had written it, because I pitched it as a proposal, and it sold, and everyone was speculating, what is this going to be about? And I hadn't even written it yet. So yeah, the creation process, I think, once you're established as a writer, is so different to the creation process before any of it has happened yet.
But I just wanted to ask, like, if you did any like specific research for like queer characters in this time period, and like how you like approach that, since like, I mean, most people don't like think that queer people even existed in the 20s. I don't want to say most people, but like that's like a common misconception. So yeah.
I mean, I completely agree that is what a lot of people believe, and I think it really reflects in the research that even exists too. Like, I definitely looked into, you know, queer narratives and real stories about, you know, people back then. But that's the thing, they get brushed under the rug, and that's why so many people believe that like queer people were invented in like the 90s or something, because it's, you know, it's always been there. They just get suppressed in narratives, especially when it comes to a country like China that's gone through a lot of like material suppression. It will get lost in history. And so the way I approached it was, these are just real people and real narratives, and as much real narrative that I can find. You know, especially with Kathleen and These Mountain Lights, that was a real thing that happened. Like, you would just take your sibling's place and have like gender affirming like identities, and it was great. People accepted it. And then a lot of times, you know, you get modern day people saying like, oh, that's unrealistic. No, it really happened. Real things that happened. And it feels like a disservice to not include that, because that's just good writing to actually represent the way that, you know, society operated. Yeah, and then with, you know, Foul Lady Fortune, I get a lot of people that are like, with Rosalind being like demisexual, they're like, am I just imagining it? And I'm like, no, I swear, like that I wrote that. Like, it's, the term might not have existed, but I swear. Because it almost seems shocking to have a historical character represent a queer identity these days. And we're kind of like, you know, if it exists now and we're going through that, it existed back then too. Again, we were not invented in the 90s. So yeah, it means a lot to me to be able to write that. And I want, especially teen readers, to have.
When you were writing their characters, did you think about their zodiac signs? And kind of going along with like what you're talking about, like how like things informed like their personalities or whatever. Just out of curiosity, like, did you think about that? Did you think about their zodiac signs? And how that affected their personality.
Okay, so when I was writing them, I didn't have that. But my roommate last year, Tashi, who's also an author, is really into astrology in a way that, like, I don't think I'm quite there yet. I don't understand it as much. I will on the occasion be like, oh, that's so Scorpio of her, but I don't know it well enough to do it all the time. She's different. She knows it well enough to like always be like that. So there was a certain point, I think right before our Valentine's came out, she was like, what are their zodiac signs? And I was like, I don't know. Like, I haven't come up with that. And she was like, you need to know, actually. So I came up with it like midway between the books. I think I decided that Juliet was a Libra. I have a whole list of this, actually. Let me find it for you. It's in my little notes app. Libra. Okay, yeah. Juliet is a Libra. Roma is a Cancer. Elisa is a Sagittarius, like me. I think that fits. Benedict is a Taurus. Marshall is a Leo. Rosalind and Celia are Virgos. Yeah, and then for the rest of them, I came up with all of that later for Lady Fortune.
What kind of impact do you want to leave with your work on young readers, especially since you're sort of like you're sort of a beacon for Asian representation, especially since you came out in 2020 and things that were like happening during that time. And it was just very nice to see this representation being shown for the first time, well, for like newer readers, I guess. So what kind of impact do you want to leave with your work, eh?
Mm-hmm. Wow, big question. I guess I really want to, I think especially there's a big crossover between young readers and young writers. I think a lot of young people these days are they really want to dip their foot into it. And I think by merely just existing and having these books out there, I want it to be permission for like young Asian writers to also say, I want to do that as well. I think there's a huge narrative in especially Asian communities where we're either artists as a hobby or we have to go through a whole career first and do it later in life. The generation above us was kind of that experience. They would talk about how they'd always loved writing or another creative form, and then they'd become a really big hotshot lawyer first, and then now that I'm financially stable, I'm gonna do writing, which that's also a very valid life path, and it really works for a lot of people. But I also know that for some people, they just want to go straight into it. They know that they're ready for it. And I kind of just want young Asian writers to feel like they have the right to do that. They don't have to wait, or they don't have to go into another career first and try that out. They can if they want. Again, it's always your mileage may vary. But yeah, I really want all of our stories to be able to get out there. I want people to have more stories. I want readers to be able to get so much more of the content that I know is out there. And I hope that I'm just one of the many eventually. In a way, like, I'm really grateful to be here and someone that can be an inspiration. I feel really weird saying that, but I hope eventually it feels less of that. It feels like, oh, there are a lot of us here, great, we can keep telling these stories of such variations and shades.